Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa. Today we're going to be discussing African multilateral financial institutions, why they matter and how to save them. I'm joined by a very special guest, Professor Daniel Bradlow. Professor Bradlow is a professor, senior research fellow at the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He's also Senior Non-Resident Fellow, Global Development Policy Center at Boston University. He's a Professor Emeritus, American University, Washington College of Law, Co-Chair Academic Circle on Right to Development, and Compliance Officer, Social and Environmental Compliance Unit, UNDP. Daniel, it's a great pleasure to have you join me today, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, and thanks for that nice introduction.
Brilliant.
Pleasure to be here.
Yes. So traditionally we've seen African countries, let's say from the post-Cold War, after the post-Second World War, where we saw the establishment of the World Bank and IMF and all of that. So traditionally, African countries have had to deal with all of this. But in recent times, we've seen Africans also develop their own kind of like multilateral development institutions. Can you give us a scope of the history of African multilateral development financial institutions and how they operate?
So it's important to remember when the World Bank and the IMF were set up in 1944, many African countries were still colonies, so they were not represented at the meetings. So when they gained independence in the 1960s and 70s, these institutions had been set up without really taking into account the needs of Africa, and so that and then suddenly they were forced with having to take care of those needs, and they weren't necessarily doing it in a way that was satisfactory or representative and responsive enough to African needs. So beginning in the 1960s, really, Africa looked to think about how to create institutions that could respond to its needs. So it created the African Development Bank, which is modeled on the World Bank and modeled on regional development banks in other parts of the world, like the Inter-American Development or the Asian Development Bank. And it was set up initially with only African countries as members of the bank. In the 1980s, it had a crisis where it wasn't able to fund its own development, and so it eventually admitted non-regional members, which meant most of the states that were members of the World Bank. At the same time, and much more silently in a way, Africa began setting up sub-regional banks. So an East African Development Bank, over time, the Trade and Development Bank for Eastern and Southern Africa, the African Export-Import Bank. And now there are about 12 or so institutions around the continent, which are primarily African members institutions that are designed specifically to promote African development in various ways. They're all controlled by Africa, but many of them also have private sector members. So pension funds, insurance companies, which the World Bank and the African Development Bank do not. So they're significantly different in their membership, Whether that makes a difference in how they operate or how they should be treated is of course a different story. But these new institutions in last year came together to form the alliance of African multilateral financial institutions.
Interesting. There are two things you've mentioned that I'd like to take you up on, and that's one of the question is, as we've seen with African Union and its laudable 2063 agenda, but one of the paradox is Africans, all of these projects are being externally funded. And then you've also mentioned in terms of from the 80s where African Development Bank began to admit uh, external people into its membership. Now, what is the level of its autonomy? If you look at all of this, is autonomy independence?
So, as a formal matter, if you look at the African Development Bank, African states have the majority of the seats and vote in the institutions. So formally, they're in control. Not by a huge amount, but compared to non-regional members, but they have the majority vote. The problem is that it raises most of its money on international financial markets. And so that if it doesn't listen to what the non-regional countries think or what credit rating agencies might think, its ability to raise money is going to be compromised, and that'll have adverse effects for African countries because the cost of borrowing from them will go up. In the case of the other institutions, those are fully controlled by African members. To the extent that they have private sector members, for example, they often have different classes of shares. So the votes are usually controlled by the states rather than the private sector. But they also have the challenge, they have to raise the money somewhere. What they're hoping to do and what they do to some extent is raise money from institutions in Africa. So pension funds, insurance companies, things like that, sovereign wealth funds. But if they want to grow, they're still going to need more money. And that means ultimately they're going to have to enter international financial markets somewhere. Not necessarily in Europe or North America, but somewhere in the world they have to enter them.
Another irony that ties into that is and a lot of some people have made argument for this, where the World Bank or international financial institutions criticize African financial institutions for the private sector membership that I've just mentioned, and how I think they call it the preferred credit status, and how they depend on all of that. But I've seen other scholars argue that because of Africans' peculiar situation and its formation, that shouldn't be a criteria that that recognition or its importance shouldn't be based on the recognition from the World Bank. What do you think? Do you maintain a different?
So I mean, you've raised a number of different issues. So let me break them down and deal with them one by one. So the issue with having private shareholders is most private institutions are profit driven, whereas institutions like the World Bank or the African Development Bank are not really driven by profit. They have to earn enough money to meet their own debts because they're borrowing and then they have to pay back those debts. But the goal is not to generate a profit and pay a dividend to their shareholders. In fact, they've never paid a dividend to their shareholders. On the other hand, if you have private sector shareholders, they do expect a dividend of some sort, and they do expect, to be paying more attention to profit. And so that begins to change the motivation of where the institution lends and on what terms it's going to lend. And so that changes things a bit. On the other hand, the challenge for Africa is if you don't include those institutions, the governments don't have enough money to really support the institutions fully. And the pools of capital that you could tap into are in pension funds, insurance funds. And so finding a balance between those two is important. Now, some people have said that because of that, you shouldn't treat them in the same way you treat the World Bank and the African Development Bank. I don't see the validity of that argument. I think these institutions still have a development purpose. I mean, when investors invest in them, they should understand that a development purpose means not that you're a losing institution, but you're not a profit maximizing institution. There's a public purpose to what you're doing, and that they're investing because they think that public purpose is an important one and they want to contribute to it. If they don't, they should go invest somewhere that's will generate a bigger profit. So that's one of the things. One of the challenges is, and the second point you raised, is that these institutions, excluding the African Development Bank, charge much higher interest rates and give much more onerous terms that are much more like commercial terms than concessional terms that like the World Bank or the African Development Bank might give. And that's because they don't have the same credit rating, so they're not as favored in the markets as those other institutions, which are AAA borrowers. So they charge a higher cost. So because they don't have a choice, their cost of funds is higher, and so they have to charge that. Some of that is related to a bigger issue, which is the cost of capital for Africa generally, and a concern that African countries are being charged a premium over what a comparable country in another part of the world might be charged. And there's debate as to why that's the case. Is it because the credit rating agencies don't really understand Africa? Do they have a bias against Africa? Or are there more technical reasons, such as the fact that African markets or African debts are not as liquid, and so that the investors expect some sort of compensation for that? But it's a very important issue that's being considered in the context of the G20 now, and a call for saying we need to understand better why African countries are paying more than other parts of the world, particularly because if you look at default rates on African projects, they're actually often better than other parts of the world, which would suggest we should be rewarded for that rather than punished. But that's not happening. And so far, the G20 has acknowledged there's an issue, but it hasn't done very much about it. So we hopefully that will be dealt with. The third issue you raised, which is an important one also, is the preferred creditor status. So, and the interesting thing is the preferred creditor status of the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank does not exist as a legal matter. It's a matter of market custom. So if you read the articles of agreement creating those institutions, there's no mention of a preferred creditor status. But there's a sense that they lend on better terms than commercial lenders, and they lend sort of counter-cyclically. When commercial lenders are pulling out, they continue lending, and so that they need to be rewarded in some way. And the preferred creditor status is kind of a reward for doing that. The question is whether these other institutions, like the African Export-Import Bank or the Trade and Development Bank, should also be given preferred creditor status. Now, they have language in their articles which say they should be given the same privileges as other international organizations. That, because it's not a legal requirement that those institutions have preferred creditor status, it's not clear whether whether there's a requirement under that language to treat them as a preferred creditor. But the truth is, even if it does, it only is binding on the countries that have signed those articles. And if other creditors don't respect that, they're perfectly within their legal rights to do that. Whether morally and politically that's legitimate is a separate question. So it's a well-debated issue, and it's become a big issue now because in the case of Zambia and Ghana, which have had to reschedule their debts over the last few years, the creditors have said, we're not interested. You cannot give preferred creditor status to the Afrexim Bank and the Trade and Development Bank. and you need to reschedule their debts just like it's a commercial creditor. And the institutions are not accepting, are not happy with that. And it creates a problem, because why are you discriminating against African multilateral financial institutions and not treating them the same way as other institutions? And it's particularly ironic because the Chinese, when Zambia was defaulting and they were talking about it, the Chinese said, why are we giving the World Bank in particular preferred creditor status when it's one of the biggest creditors to Zambia? Because if it's such a big creditor, it should be contributing like everybody else to giving support to Zambia. But the bargaining power, I suppose, is ultimately what determines the outcome. And so Zambia and Ghana have been forced into treating these African institutions more like commercial creditors, which is a problem.
What we see again, if we look at still so much paradox here. So if you look at I'll be sympathetic to the Chinese perception of the World Bank, and if we look at from the 80s where you had the world recession and all of that, look at what's going on and look at how the World Bank themselves, I don't think they have been prudent in their contribution to the debt crisis in Africa. But what would you say? Do you think it's when we look at the World Bank and how, well, I say the ease with which African governments themselves have been indebted to this, do you think that there's some kind of like political agenda to this? And do they have the moral right to then criticize the African multilateral institutions if you look at their own history of creating this debt in African countries?
I think they have a lot to answer for. I mean, the structural adjustment programs in the 80s, promoted particularly by the IMF, did a lot of damage in many African countries. And they've never fully accepted responsibility for that and been held accountable for it. On the other hand, I think there is an argument that when, say, Zambia, if we're talking about Zambia, gets into debt problems and it needs money and no commercial creditors and no government, other donor countries are willing to lend it money, if the World Bank comes into what's obviously a bad credit situation and says we will lend you money on reasonable terms, that the World Bank should have confidence that they don't have to reschedule that debt and take a loss on that debt. Just like in a bankruptcy, a lender into a bankrupt organization should be protected in some way. So in that sense, I think it makes sense. I think, though, what's needed, either no one should have preferred creditor status, or all these institutions should have it, or there should be standards that says if you agree you're going to lend money and in certain ways when the country gets into trouble, then you get preferred creditor status. So there's some sort of objective standard, and we can say, for example, Afreximbank meets that standard, but TDB does not meet that standard. And here's why, and everybody can understand that. And the World Bank gets the same treatment as everybody else. Preferred creditor status shouldn't mean that they're more preferred than any other preferred creditor either.
So why is the failure? What is the failure to standardize this preferred status creditor?
It's because it's by custom and it's evolved sort of through over time. So when it first evolved, it was the World Bank and the IMF essentially, and the big regional development banks, African, Inter-American development banks, and there weren't that many of them, and they were lending in difficult times, and so it made sense to give them the preferred creditor status because they played a particular role in the in the world. The other banks didn't really exist or were so small that nobody was really thinking about them, but they're becoming more important as the World Bank, the IMF become weaker and have less resources to lend and less bargaining power. These other institutions are starting to play a more important role. And so how they treat it becomes a bigger issue. I mean, in For example, the Afreximbank, in the case of Ghana, has about $700 million of debt owing to it, which is a not insignificant amount. In the case of South Sudan, for example, the Afreximbank had lent about $650 million, and South Sudan was not paying the money back. So, which is an important issue for the bank, because I mean, it's not that big that it can afford to write off those kind of debts without getting money back. Yeah.
So what is let's put it this way. So if we in kind of like principle, we can understand the African multilateral financial institutions, their mandates and all of that. But if we look in terms of practice and all of these examples that you've brought up, in the case of the South Sudan, in case of Ghana, what are the things that they've put in place to check against, or so to become more sustainable or more efficient?
So I think the creation of the alliance of all these institutions is an important development, because they can learn from each other, they can work together, they can coordinate to help African development in a more sort of consistent and coherent way. That's number one. Number two, I think they have to stick to their actual mandates. They've got to be very prudent and careful to develop their credibility and make sure they're not lending in an imprudent way. And that is not clear that all of them have done that so far. And so they need to do that more effectively. But if they do that, they can play a really critical role in helping African countries negotiate more effectively for money. They can be the intermediary between small African countries and financial markets to make sure they get better terms and more sustainable development finance. They can, particularly now in the changing global environment and sort of a world that's becoming more hostile to developing countries, they can promote fund the infrastructure that integrates the continent more, so that the Continental Free Trade Agreement allows African trade to develop and the continent to grow internally without being as dependent on the rest of the world. So,
I'm happy you mentioned that there's hostile global environments, and not just hostile as well. I think it's also a world that is becoming more dynamic and changing, geopolitical competitions and all of that. And I link that to Trump's tariffs and where the majority of Africans have been specifically targeted about 36 states in Africa thereabout. And again, where we had an episode the last time where we're looking at these tariffs and how that could inadvertently push Africans to be more self-reliant. So if I look at it as one approach, where I look at the domestic capital in Africa alone, where I think is estimated at about over $1 trillion.
Yeah.
And all of these other funds, how are they taking advantage? How is these African multilateral investors? How are they, or how can they take advantage of this domestic market to be?
So, I mean, I think they can, because as you say, there's a lot of money on the continent that's not being used effectively in the continent. It might be being invested outside the continent, but it's not being used effectively inside. Sometimes that's because in some countries, they don't, the investors who have that money don't fully trust their own governments and don't want to invest. So investing through a regional development bank gives them a way of doing that, where they can have more confidence, and they can mitigate the risk of their own government not doing what they think is the best approach. So that's one way. But I think, I mean, at the end of the day, domestic markets have to be developed. And these institutions can also help develop the markets, because they have the expertise, they understand the local environments in countries, but they have the global understanding as well. So they can develop the markets in ways that can stimulate development and can change the dynamics in the countries. And as I said, if they focused on regional integration as well, they can help make, particularly for small countries, help develop the scale that they can trade in a way that becomes profitable and that allows more development on a regional and continental level. The other thing is, I mean, part of the lesson of Trump's tariffs is you shouldn't be too dependent on the richest countries in the world. You need to diversify and look at, Latin America, Asia, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, all the areas you need to be open to every part of the world. That's obviously doesn't happen overnight. It's going to take a while to develop those markets. But these institutions, because they have a global reach, can also help promote that and help small companies understand how to tap into global markets. Particularly with the new technologies that are developing, it becomes much easier to do that. So that it's more feasible now than in the 60s.
But if you look at that in terms of, I know Africa, even during the Cold War, they had this non-alliance. They were non-aligned to stuff. And then if you then look at in terms of how the geopolitics has been played out now, where you see expansions in BRICS, for instance, and stuff like that, would that be a way where would that be a response to that need to diversify?
It definitely can be. And in the last couple of days, President Lula in Brazil has said he's going to reach out to India and I assume the other BRICS countries to talk about a sort of coordinated response to the Trump tariffs. Particularly because Brazil and India have been singled out for political reasons. I would add, I think South Africa, to some extent, has also been. And having a forum where you can talk about that in a way and say, look, maybe we can't retaliate against the US directly, but at least let's develop trade amongst ourselves so that we're not as dependent on them. And I mean, the BRICS is one possibility. I mean, the lesson of the non-aligned movement is the interests of developing countries are so diverse that getting agreement beyond the highest level of abstraction can be very difficult. So we'll have to see how it plays out. Yeah,
I agree. You mentioned China before, and we've seen. I don't know the scope of China's, but we've seen that China has in the last over a decade with its Belt and Road Initiative, it's carried out significant infrastructure developments. It's lent money to many. You mentioned Zambia and many other countries. And then again, we've also seen, besides the superpowers, the great powers, we've seen other kind of like middle powers like Turkey and playing a role, increasing role in Africa. So would you see? And recently, Saudi Arabia had this development project in Africa 2030 project. So would you see these people as competitors to the African multilateral, or these as collaborators? How do you see all this parallel?
They could be either. To me, I mean, when you're talking about economic relations, every country's thinking about its own interest in particular transactions, and so that whether they suit your needs or not depends on the facts of each particular transaction. I don't think you should think China's a better friend to Africa than the UAE or the United States. You should say, in this particular transaction, am I getting what I need at an acceptable cost? And then I'll do it to whoever they are. And we want as many investors and partners as we can possibly get. And China has definitely made important contributions in some countries, but I think there's some countries where people would say, well, it looks like China's supported some corruption, some projects that are white elephants that we could have done without. And to some extent, China should have been more responsible, but so should the governments that negotiated those contracts in thinking, are we getting what we really need here?
I agree with you. And part of what my current research, I've been looking at the issue of stabilization. And I've been arguing that it's naive to assume that there's going to be an intervention that is altruistic. Everyone comes with an interest, but there's also room for people to be able to negotiate their interests and protect that interest. So I think that should be the way forward. But again, if you look at how Africa, speaking of interest, I want to ask if you think this is just something that is aspirational or ambitious with the 2063 African solutions, the African problem, and the African stance to underserved. Do you see that as aspirational? How does these African multilateral institutions fit into that agenda?
So I mean, I can't conceive of what the world will look like in 2063. But I think it's important to have a goal, in a sense that we need to develop in a particular way. And in that sense, I think Agenda 2063 is a positive. I mean, as you say, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's aspirational rather than a realistic agenda. I mean, hopefully we get there before 2063, but realistically that might not be an option. But all these, it gives us a structure and a goal to aim for. And all these mechanisms, the multilateral financial institutions, the trade agreements, human rights standards, all of that can help us make our way to those goals and give us not only the way to do it, but also the tests that we can use to say, are we doing it in the right way now? So that in 2025, we can say we're making progress. And in 2030, we're going to be in a better place because we can use tests to say we've done this and we're more integrated, more people are getting access to education and health than had it before or not. And we must be worried and work out why not and what do we need to do to correct that.
I think one of the things we didn't discuss, I think I should have asked you early on, is you mentioned the sub-regional African multi institutions. You have the AfriSem, you have African Development Bank, RDAPS, and you have these other ones. Can you disaggregate them in terms of, do they have specific roles? Do you have ones that target infrastructure development, and how do they play out?
So the AfriXim Bank is an African export-import bank. So it's focused on trade, and it's meant to be helping African countries and African companies learn how to be able to trade better, both within the continent and around the world. But it's it should be a trade bank. Part of the problem is it hasn't always stuck to being a trade bank, and that's part of the issue with them. The Trade and Development Bank is limited to the COMESA countries, so Eastern and Southern African countries, but it's more broadly development projects, so infrastructure projects, potentially health and education projects. The other banks, then there's some insurance institutions that are meant to promote reinsurance, particularly and develop an insurance market to support development. The African Finance Corporation is to help private sector infrastructure development. Some of the other banks, like the East African Development Bank, is obviously designed just for that one region of the world. And there are a number of those that are focused on specific regions as well. And that's why having a mechanism to coordinate them, because, I mean, if the East African Development Bank's funding something, you don't necessarily need the Trade and Development Bank or the African Finance Corporation stepping in to help with that.
There are other things as well, like beyond, just in line with that answer, beyond these hard infrastructures and all of that, we have all the softwares, like you're talking about, digital transformation, human capital development, and public health security. How are they function in that sense?
So, I mean, I suppose in the division of labor that's happened in a way is some of those, like the digital transformation, some of that's hard infrastructure, is power projects, is power for the electricity to promote the infrastructure, the laying of the cables and all that. The more softer sides, the sort of development of education and human capital, some of that has been the bilateral aid. So the US, UK, and that cutting of that is a serious problem in the short run, at least. The World Bank has also been more willing to fund sort of primary health and education sorts of projects than some of these regional institutions, and maybe that's not a bad division of responsibility. I mean, some division like that might not be a bad thing. I mean, one can certainly argue that African governments have a responsibility to fund health and education, but we know that African governments are stretched very thin, and raising the money for that when they're borrowing money for other things and having to pay it back at high interest rates is a problem. So and the cutting. I mean, I think as a general principle, it's better not to be dependent on the charity of other countries for all sorts of reasons. And so that in a sense, even though it's being done in a shamefully horrendous way, not being as dependent on aid is probably in the long run better for Africa than
I agree with you. And I wanted to say it in terms of how, again, going back to the post-Second World War, how I think aid was a mechanism to control economic development in Africa and other kind of like third world countries, if I can use that term. But then again, one of the things I think African citizens themselves do not necessarily. So when we talk about Africa, sometimes we fail to that the African citizens themselves, the people themselves, do not benefit from this money that are being borrowed. It's the elite, and they see it as creating, financing the lifestyle of the elites, goes into the private pocket. So I guess the African people themselves do not want this. So I guess what I'm saying is this: how does the African multilateral financial institutions, how do they seek to make the argument that they will be different from, let's say, the World Bank, and kind of creating those kind of like debt crisis that we have with, or promoting not the elite, putting money in the pockets of the elites rather than the people?
So, I mean, that's a big question, and and I suppose I can't speak for the institutions and say how they make that argument themselves, but a couple of points. I mean, one is there's only so much you can expect at the international level. There's a certain amount that just has to be done at the domestic level. And, the international organizations can help or hinder the chances of achieving progress at a domestic level. But at the end of the day, it's the people themselves who have to sort of hold their governments accountable, as difficult as that definitely is in some situations. So that's point one. Point two is, so the World Bank, the African Development Bank have independent accountability mechanisms. So if there's a project in a country, for example, let's say, just take the World Bank as an example, and the communities that are affected by that project think that they've been harmed by the project, and they've been harmed because the World Bank is not doing what it should according to its own policies about how it should do projects. They can bring a complaint and have it investigated by a private mechanism, and have the bank sort of hold itself accountable for complying with its own policies and standards. And its policies on environmental and social issues are not necessarily they're not perfect, but they're state of the art. They're the best probably in the world, and so that you can get relief. And there has, for example, there was a road project in Uganda where the road was being built, and the World Bank was funding the project, and the contractors brought young men into remote areas, and there was all sorts of sexual harassment that took place. A complaint was brought to the World Bank inspection panel, and it resulted in a fund being set up to compensate the girls who had been raped in many cases, who'd had children and had to drop out of school, so to give them better opportunities. It's not perfect, but it's a way of holding them accountable. These African institutions could do things like that to say, look, these are complicated projects in difficult environments. We know we're going to get it wrong sometimes. We're not trying to blame anyone, but we want to correct mistakes when they happen, so people are not harmed more than is reasonable, and we learn from that and can do better in the future. And none of them, to the best of my knowledge, except for the African Development Bank, have a mechanism like that. And there's no reason they couldn't create one for each of them, or possibly more realistically, one that covers all of them, so that they can have a mechanism for learning from their mistakes, and for making sure that when people are harmed, that they don't have to bear an unfair burden of the harm of a project that might be benefiting the country as a whole.
Before I come to the last question, let me tax you on this, because you co-chaired the academic on the right to development. So when we look at Africa, when they talk about the United Nations rights and talk about civil and political rights, Africans and other have always emphasized the economic and social rights, and that has not been very in legal terms. That is not one that is really respected or promoted. So if you look at, do you think, because I know Africans have set up NEPAD and things like this to talk about what is more important to Africa in terms of this economic right to develop, do you think that is something that is hindering development in Africa, or hindering these mechanisms to be put in place? Because at the institutional level, at the government level, it is not, what is that word now? Is it jury? You can't hold them accountable. You can't hold the government accountable for instance, for creating homelessness. You can't sue them. You can't, for the right to development. Do you think that's one of the hindrances?
I mean, to be honest with you, some of it you can. In some countries, you can sue for some of that. For example, under the South African Constitution, there are rights. You can't be evicted from your home without some protections. I'm not suggesting that works perfectly, and that there aren't cases of people who suffer terrible loss without getting recourse, but there is at least legally the possibility. Part of the problem with human rights, the challenge with human rights, is human rights law says that all rights are co-equal, interdependent, and interconnected. I mean, as a practical matter, that's just not realistic. You can't implement them all at once perfectly. And we don't know how you prioritize between them. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be taking rights seriously. And that if a government says, look, we've decided we're going to prioritize economic rights now, that doesn't mean that you lose all your civil and political rights until you've got all your economic rights. I mean, there are mechanisms, the African Court for Human and People's Rights, where you can bring cases. They're weak, but they're mechanisms. In the context of development, part of the reason I think these accountability mechanisms are so important is because we don't know which is the best way to do development. And these are the only mechanism where communities bring cases with complaints of what's actually happened to them, and they get them investigated, and the reports get heard at the highest levels of the bank, in the boards of directors, the senior management, and they have to think about what is the impact of what we've done and how do we do this better. And you hope over time they start saying, we need to consult with the communities more directly. We need to consult with governments about how they want to work with their communities. It's a slow process, but we don't have any other better way of doing that if we want to respect the sovereignty of states as well.
Well, let me come to the last question. So let's say if you just take a broad outlook and say, looking at the challenges that you've mentioned, so how do we overcome these challenges, and how can African multilateral financial institutions be more efficient, and how can they gain that global recognition as on an equal standing with already established institutions like the World Bank and IMF?
So I would say there's an institution in Latin America called CAF, which I forget the Spanish version of it, but it started off as a small, weak institution, and over time it built up its credibility. So now it's viewed as one of the most effective development banks in the world, and it's one of the biggest in Latin America. And I think part of the way to build up the African institutions is we have to make African governments take them more seriously. And in a way, for me, there's a lot of talk about, which is correct, that the World Bank and the IMF don't give enough voice to African governments, that they should have more say and more stake in those institutions, and they should be more responsive. But I think rather than spend time fighting that battle, as important as it is, if African governments took the money that they say they're going to put into the World Bank and the IMF, and they put it into these institutions, and they spent more time focused on these institutions and saying, how do we make them stronger and better? I mean, they're our institutions. They're focused on our development. They understand our needs better. I think we'd get more bang for our buck. And it would also make citizens look up and take them more seriously and say, we need to make them more accountable and make sure they're doing what we want. And because they're closer to the ground, we can have more say and more control over what they do. It's a long process.
Yeah, but we surely get there. Professor Bradlow, it's been an amazing time. I really enjoyed, your insight into these conversations, into this topic, and there's a lot to learn, and there's like you said, it's a long process, but it does seem that there's some progress that have been made, even though there are challenges that remains. But yes, we're grateful for having you on board.
Thank you very much. This was great.
Yeah. You have a great day.
You too. Take care.
Bye. Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in today. Help me as usual to thank Professor Daniel Bradlow for his very, very rich insights into African multilateral financial institutions, why they matter and how we should save them. For now, stay blessed, and I'll see you next week.